Howdy. Okay, so let's talk about evolutionarily stable strategies and reciprocity. So we talked about inclusive fitness already in the context of Hamilton's rule. So I'm just going to mention this again. We talked about relatedness times the benefit has to be greater than the cost for a helpful behavior to be favored. Now we're going to kind of turn that concept on its head a little bit. We talked about in the context of ground squirrels. Remember how ground squirrels are much more likely to give warning calls in the presence of close relatives. Females are more related than males. Ground squirrels give more calls when surround in groups of females than in when they're closest to males. They give more calls when they're near their own family members than unrelated individuals. That there's that whole table. But the interesting thing is that I want to bring up now is that increased relatedness does not always lead to helpful behavior. And to understand why, we'll look at the example of the white-fronted bee eater. So bee eaters, they eat bees, and they often, not always, they nest in aggregations. So they'll dig nests out of the banks of rivers, sort of in the mud and sand, and they live in colonies or groups of these nest burrows. They also often breed cooperatively. So about half of the nests in one population that was studied have adult helpers. In contrast to squirrels, it's the males that tend to stay near where they were born. The females disperse. So unlike in mammals, where you often have matrilines, think vampire bats, lions, ground squirrels, in bee eaters, you have clans of patrilines. So the interesting thing is that sometimes individuals suffer harassment that prevents them from breeding independently. So what does harassment mean? The adults will chase the young birds and will beg from the young birds. They'll invade the young birds' nest chambers. And the interesting thing is that this harassment is always carried out by a dominant breeding pair towards a subordinate pair, specifically a pair that has the male offspring of that dominant pair. And that's kind of interesting. So oftentimes harassment leads to the subordinate pair abandoning their own nest, and then the male joining the dominant pair as a helper. So this is interesting. So younger birds, but also more closely related males, are much more likely to suffer harassment, but they're also more likely to um, be recruited, in other words, to end up helping their parents or their related adults um, rear young. And so in each of these cases, the hatched are males and the solid females, and the age is in years, and relatedness is in the lower graph. And it's this sort of non-intuitive thing. You only, it's the when it gets talked about in meetings, it's the you only hurt the ones you love. In this case, you only harass your close relatives, because if you harass unrelated birds, they might abandon their own nest, but they're still not going to help you. Whereas because of kin selection, when you force your close relatives to not be able to breed independently, it is still in their genetic interest to get some reproductive success, and that could be increasing the number of offspring that you have. So these birds are much more rational and optimal than we were behaving in the beginning of class. Sadly, I meant to draw out that point before. You harass your closest relatives because only close relatives will help their dominant relatives rear offspring. Non-relatives might abandon breeding, but wouldn't be recruited to help, right? Because they have no genetic interest in the offspring of the dominant pair, whereas close relatives do have a genetic interest in the offspring of the dominant pair. And so if you prevent them from breeding, they'll actually come back and help. So they worked out the sort of inclusive fitness. Juveniles are less experienced breeders, so they don't usually raise that many young when they breed on their own. They 0.51 young on average independently. However, if they return to help, their parents will rear almost half of an extra chick on average, with the help of the subordinate son. And so that means that only relatives have a reason to help if they're prevented from breeding. They can kind of make back most of their lost fitness, their lost reproductive success by helping. Non-relatives wouldn't. So I then want to talk a little bit about cooperation and defection in the context of unrelated individuals. So Dawkins gives a good description of the prisoner's dilemma. And remember that the most important thing is that in the case of the prisoner's dilemma, it gets described in a bunch of contexts. One is that you and someone else commit a crime together. That's the prisoner's dilemma. They have enough evidence for you to put each of you in jail for a shorter period. However, they're asking each of you separately to testify against the other. Now, if neither of you testify, so you're cooperating with the other prisoner, then you'll have you'll have some prison term, let's say, and then that's the reward for cooperation. The problem, if, however, you cooperate by not testifying against the opponent, and your opponent defects by testifying against you, you get nothing. So let's say that could be, you get the longest jail term. That would be minus, you're going to lose 5 months. However, if both of you cooperate, you each go to jail for 2 months. However, if you were to defect against your opponent, you don't go to jail. Your opponent goes to jail for 5 months. However, if both of you testify against each other, then you both go to jail for 4 months. right? So this is often, and so what's interesting in this case is um, that the sort of that everyone, if everyone's doing the same thing, it's much better if everyone is cooperating than if everyone is defecting. However, the temptation of defecting while your opponent cooperates is high, um, and of course the cost of being of cooperating when your partner defects is the highest. And what this means is what's sort of critical to see here is that if your opponent cooperates, it's better to defect than to cooperate, right? Because the reward for T is greater than the reward for of R, right? In this case, 0 is greater than -2. So if your opponent cooperates, it's better to defect. If your opponent defects, it's better to defect, right? So the mutual spite or spite is has a greater benefit than the sucker's payoff. In other words, -4 is greater than -5. So what this leads to is the prediction that an optimal strategy is to defect, right? Because no matter if your opponent cooperates, it's better to defect than cooperate. If your opponent defects, your opponent, your partner, the other player defects, it's better to defect than cooperate. So that leads to this prediction that an optimal strategist will always defect. And this also leads to the problem that like no one should ever cooperate. So we're not gonna do prisoner's dilemma here, but in general, you know, the point value doesn't really matter. Will make it a little bit more it makes a little bit more sense when you think of this as um, when you think of this in terms of sort of positive rewards. So we'll do the same payoffs as before, but in so that they're positive. And what's important is P stands here for punishment. If you're punishing someone else who's defecting, um, you're better off than being a sucker, which is cooperating when someone else is defecting. And then the reward for mutual cooperation, which would be it would be better if everyone cooperated versus everyone defecting. However, it's better to there's always the temptation to defect when your opponent cooperates because the reward would be highest. And so there were contests set up in the 70s to try to where different algorithms were fought against each other in a virtual arena. People would submit their algorithms and the program would run basically a simulation with different little bots following different strategies. And it was discovered that that there was a very successful strategy. This is in the 70s. It's called tit for tat, right? And tit for tat is, can anyone tell me what the strategy is for tit for tat? Um, so let's just, before we do this, because it's in the reading and it's really clear there, but before we get into sort of the conditions for reciprocity, let's go over what is tit for tat as a strategy. There's two parts for tit for tat. What does the tit for tat strategy do in an initial round of this kind of game? No, that's what it does after. The first thing it does is first cooperate and then copy whatever strategy the opponent plays. And this strategy, what that does is, by cooperating, if there's another cooperator, you get the benefit of cooperation. You get that reward from the upper left hand. And then, however, if you meet up with a defector, you only lose once, and after that, you cut your losses. Okay, so tit for tat is a very um, effective strategy. No single strategy is, going to have the highest reward because any single strategy is going to be sort of vulnerable. Um, but um, but that tit for tat strategy is a good one, and it led to this idea that reciprocity, um, which means basically punishing cheaters and cooperating when you can, um, should be an effective strategy that can maintain, cooperative behavior. But it's only going to thrive under certain conditions, right? So you need stable associations, because without stable associations, um, you can't. Um, Without stable associations, you can't punish cheaters. Without stable associations, um, you need you can't punish cheaters. So you need stable associations to punish cheaters, and to reward cooperators and get the benefits of cooperating. It's actually like social systems that require or encourage stable associations are likely to foster sort of better behavior than ones where you can just swoop in once and have an association with some random individual. Um, Cheaters must be recognized, which is important. So you have to know who is cheating, and so a lot of like social systems and stuff um, is are designed basically to like increase social knowledge, or at least that's what people spend a lot of time doing, is gossiping about others and trying to figure out how other individuals are behaving. And then finally, the benefit to the receiver has to be greater than the cost to the donor um, in order to um, in order for, and this was a question that we had trouble with on the midterm, in order for um, there to be a net profit when the cooperation is returned. And so we talked before about the vampire bats as a good example of this, and that figure. Um, I just want to point out a little bit some more examples of reciprocity, and then we're going to talk about a bunch more examples in nature. So some file sharing networks have rules that are designed to encourage cooperative behavior. And they do that by restricting membership and download speeds based on different kinds of cooperative behavior. So interestingly, so users are rewarded or punished for um, the uploading and not just downloading files. And those rules can regulate like the speeds of your downloads and the number of files you can download or depend on how often you upload. And so these rules can be set up to enforce and encourage cooperation. And in BitTorrent, apparently it's not just your own uploading behavior, but it's the um, cooperative behavior of any members into a network that you invite that will then determine your access to files and download speeds. So it's kind of interesting that some systems, and again, you know, this is cooperation among individuals that are all, you know, like breaking copyright law, but they're still, you know, separate from those laws and rules. Within the group, there are rules that are set up to enforce cooperation. And that is a kind of reciprocity. Um, so the assumptions of the reciprocal altruism in or versus the prisoner's dilemma. One is that associations are random in a population. So in that prisoner's dilemma, um, the associations are random, and that's going to favor defecting. So however, in real populations, you can see that there's going to be strong selection for associating with cooperators. However, remember that both defectors and cooperators want to associate with cooperators. Right? So that means there's going to be strong selection to look like a cooperator no matter what, and there's strong selection to be able to detect cooperators and defectors, and everyone wants to associate with cooperators, which is interesting. In the prisoner's dilemma, cooperate and defect are the only two choices, and they're discrete strategies. And it's actually kind of interesting when you allow for sort of continuous variation in this cooperation versus defection. So some of the other games that we're going to be talking about, like the ultimatum game, is one with continuous variation in cooperation and defecting. The other thing about the prisoner's dilemma is that cooperate versus defect is the only trait that's under selection. And in the Unto Others book, and also in the Not by Genes Alone, they make the important point that a single altruistic trait might be very expensive, but a second trait to enforce altruism, to make other people be altruistic, might actually be very cheap, not cost free, but cheap. So I'll just write that down. The first trait of altruism or cooperation might be very expensive, but a second trait of enforcing cooperation might be very inexpensive. And you can, I mean, I talked about this before, and they talk about it in the book, like getting a gun, which raises the likelihood of like death by accident or suicide or whatever. So it's a very expensive trait. And then like standing there and keeping guard of your house and fighting off burglars might be a very expensive trait, but contributing a small amount to taxes so that there's a police force of other people taking that risk might be much less expensive. Um, okay, so we're going to talk about um, a bunch of examples that sort of address these, and then we're going to talk a little bit about altruistic punishment, and that'll be the end for this evening. So there's been a lot of study of like tit for tat and reciprocity in predator inspection in guppies. So you probably can't quite see it from this figure because I'm sure that it's not clear enough, but over here is a guppy. See a little guppy? That's the guppy. Okay, there he is. There's his eye. There's his pectoral fin. Okay, and then here is a predator who can swallow that guppy in, you know, a single bite. Um, in a lot of shoaling fish, um, one or more individuals from the group will make little swims near the predator, not right next to the predator, but close enough to inspect the predator. And what they're probably doing is testing whether they can swim a certain distance towards the predator without the predator attacking. And that will gauge, you know, the predator's hunger level and whether it's actually hunting and other things. And this behavior is costly because um, the time that you're spending inspecting the predator, everyone else in the group is feeding, and because you're the closest to the predator, so if the predator is out for food, you're putting yourself in tremendous risk. Um, and the costs will be much less if two or more of you make these inspections. And so the question is, like, should you cooperate by joining other fish to inspect predators, or should you defect by never inspecting the predator and always letting other fish inspect the predator? So it's a system that actually over many years in the 70s and 80s, they worked out that yes, this is a costly behavior. Sometimes the inspectors get eaten and they also are not eating. And yes, your risks as an inspector are much less if there are multiple inspectors. So the benefits better if everyone is cooperating. But if you defect and you never do an inspection, you might be getting the benefit of others inspecting and never paying the costs yourself. So the R, S, T, and P um, relationships are held. So I'm going to just write that down. You know, the um, the temptation, never defect, never inspect, reward is greater than if multiple individuals are inspecting. They're each only getting a small risk. Whereas if no one inspects, then there is a danger of more attack from the predator on anyone in the group. However, if you're the only one that inspects and everyone else lets you inspect all the time, you take on a tremendous risk. So the T greater than R greater than P greater than S relationship seems to hold. So there have been a bunch of studies of this behavior. This is one that actually just showed that that guppies like to associate with cooperators more than defectors, and they did this by studied this by having you know, an arrangement in fish tanks. That's the beauty of guppies. Remember the mate choice copying that was done with like a single female in the center, two males either with or without a female on the sides, and the female choice would switch towards the one that another female had appears to have chosen. So there's mate choice copying. In this case, there's a predator, and you have a focal individual in the middle, and then you'll have a fish that sometimes is constrained, has to be closer to the predator or has to be farther from the predator. And this focal individual will basically always want to move and associate with. Then if you give it a choice, who does it want to hang out with in a tank? It's going to want to hang out with the cooperator, the one that previously had been closer to the predator. So there's a preference for then associating with the fish that had been a close approacher before. Whether or not the focal individual had inspected itself and swam close to the predator or not swum close to the predator, afterwards it wanted to be with the cooperator. So this kind of indicates that, you know, cooperative behavior is recognized in this system, and everyone wants to be with an altruist, but they want to do that whether or not they themselves were willing to inspect the predator. So that's kind of interesting. This has been replicated, and it's been studied in multiple species. This is a recent example. This is actually from this year, 2021, in Anna Pimentel et al. In Animal Behavior. And so since the previous one was in 1991 and was just done with like tanks with actual predator fish, but behind a glass container, this one wanted to be more uniform. So it was a video of a predator that was being shown to the fish, and there was a mirror that was next to the tank. And so if the mirror is parallel to the tank, then if the mirror is parallel to the tank, then wherever this fish swims, it will see another fish going just as far as it. So it appears to have a cooperative partner, no matter how close there's another fish. If, however, you have a mirror at an angle, this looks like a defector, right? Because now if the fish is here approaching the video of the predator, the reflection is going to look, it's going to be perpendicular, right? So it'll look like there's another fish over here. So it looks farther away. So for this focal fish, if the mirror is parallel, it looks like, yeah, I'm with you, buddy. I'm coming. You're going farther, I'm going farther. You're going farther, I'm going farther. Or closer to the predator. Whereas if the mirror is at an angle, it looks like there's another fish that's defecting, saying, yeah, you go to the predator. I'll hang back here. I'll let you get between me and the predator. And what they found was that here we have the cooperating mirror, so that's parallel. The defecting mirror, which means at an angle. Mirror, when they have a defecting mirror, there's no change in the probability of inspecting a predator, basically the amount of time spent in what's called the inspection zone. sorry, I didn't mean to cross that out. I meant to underline it. So this is what you have here is the average is that there's an increase, a positive change in the proportion of time spent in the inspection zone when there's always a buddy. And so these earlier studies, like the Alfieri, Dugakin and Alfieri before, um, were criticized because maybe fish just like to shoal, maybe fish just like to stay in a group. And so if you have a mirror, the fish likes to stay near an image of another fish, separate from the fact that there's a predator. And so they tested that in this case by seeing if the effect remained when there wasn't any playback of a predator cue. So when they did that, there was no effect of the mirror being parallel or at an angle. It didn't change the amount of time in that predator inspection zone. So it only increased the time when there was actually a predator, when it seemed like what you had was a buddy to inspect the predator. So that's kind of cool. And it seems like fish are behaving in a reciprocity relationship, like a tit for tat. Basically, if they are in the presence of what they perceive as a cooperator, the first experiment showed that they like to hang out with cooperators. And then the second experiment shows they're willing to go closer to the predator when they have a cooperating partner. And so this preference for cooperative individuals is seen in humans as well. So a couple of the authors uh, um, talk about Machiavellianism, which has a bit of a literature in human psychology. It's basically manipulativeness and selfishness in humans. And so Machiavellianism is a trait that can be like scored in questionnaires because that's how human psychology is always studied. Um, and you can assess it by having questions, hidden amongst a whole bunch of other questions so that someone isn't like trying to game the test. Um, the degree to which people agree or disagree with the statement, like never tell anyone the real reason you did something unless it's useful to do so. Um, and then, so people who agree strongly with sentences with expressions like that, that score high on this sort of Machiavellianism index, behave differently in other situations. So interestingly, high Mach and low Mach individuals were equally likely to steal from a distrustful supervisor in a contrived setting, but high Mach individuals were more likely to steal from a trusting one. So low Mach individuals were more likely to be sort of reciprocally altruistic, like if the supervisor showed trust, they responded by not stealing, whereas high Mach individuals were sort of wired to take advantage of cooperative behavior rather than to reciprocate. Um, it was cited in the context of like performance as salespeople in another study. And high Machs had much higher commissions in companies that had competitive sales goals, like a single bonus that went only to those that sold the most. Low Machs did better in companies that were more structured, where basically your performance was assessed not in competition with others, rather just in meeting certain metrics or goals individually. So the other thing to sort of another interesting point about this human Machiavellianism trait is that it varies within individuals based on sort of relationships. In other words, if you ask questions in the context of how would you treat, a relative or, someone, in this case, different gender associations, the Machiavellian index was like greatest when you in female-female um, sort of contexts of questioning answers. Like, in other words, that sorry, Machiavellian index was lowest in female-female associations than in male-male, and then it was higher in male-female, and highest in female-male associations. So it's interesting. People who score high in a Machiavellian index are attractive in some contexts. Um, when you're so MF versus FM is asking a male about interactions with females versus asking a female about interactions with males. Um, High Machiavellian scoring individuals are seen as leaders and as persuasive. Um, and then interesting, this raises an interesting question, because what we're talking about with the fish and in just the basic sort of modeling of reciprocity is that everyone should want to associate with, no, I think the idea is that they behave in a Machiavellian fashion towards males. Is this because people are suckers and so people tend to be fooled by individuals with high Machiavellian index? Or is there a benefit to associating with high Machiavellian individuals? In other words, is it useful to have associations with Machiavellian individuals? The funny thing is, obviously that's in um, this is from a review by Wilson, David Sloan Wilson, who is in the talks about it in the reading in the Unto Others. And then there's, review paper that I'm referring to here. It was sort of interesting reading about this in, 2000 and teaching it over the last decade. But then, we had, one of the highest Machiavellian index people like in history, who just, won the presidency. And so again, it's an unanswered question whether individuals were, you know, really enamored because um, they're, they're being duped by a high Machiavellian individual, or because they are rationally entering into an association because they think it'll help. Um, and that's an unresolved debate. So it's kind of interesting. Um, so in the Wilson et al. Study, they, like most things in human psychology, it's studied with undergrads, in this case, at, University of Binghamton. Um, Students were asked to write a fictional story about being stranded on an island with two other individuals. And then other students were given these short stories and asked to evaluate the Machiavellian score of the protagonists. And, the stories are great because students were creative and stuff. And so, like, some people would write things like, Mary Jane and I are really starting to trust each other. And then another story would be like, Mary and Jane are cold bitches. I wonder if I could cook them with the limited equipment we have. Um, so it's sort of funny, but what was cool and sort of interesting about the study was that the Machiavellian levels of the protagonists of these stories, as rated by other readers, matched the levels of the authors as students when going through that questionnaire about, how strongly do you agree or disagree with never tell anyone the real reason for doing something, right? So it's an interesting question how sort of valid and helpful this concept is, but it seems to be like a consistent and recognizable personality trait that will, come out when you assess for it. So the interesting thing was, this question about how attractive or unattractive Machiavellian individuals are. Um, the protagonists of the high Mach authors were recognized or seen as selfish, uncaring, aggressive, or untrustworthy. Um, but and you know, when asked, people would say that they would not want someone like that for a long-term partner, but would be favored for short-term relationships, like, you know, a teammate on a debate team, or maybe a sports team. Hmm. Sorry, I'm losing. Um, okay, I'm not sure if that. Okay. Um, so I I want to talk a little bit about punishment, sometimes called moralistic or altruistic punishment, and that why is it called that? It's called moralistic punishment because it um, both forces altruistic behavior and it has some cost. So moralistic punishment is different from like just taking someone's stuff, right? So like if someone comes back from a hunt and doesn't share the food, and then you go and you take some of their food, it's hard to say, is that like moralistic punishment or you're benefiting from the food? So it has to be um, at a net cost or some cost to the punisher. Um, and it's interesting to study that in both animal and human contexts, and we're mostly going to talk about it in animal contexts. In this lecture, we're going to talk about moralistic punishment in humans in upcoming. Um, so this was what I was talking about before. Within a single group, altruistic traits are not evolutionarily stable. And you know, just remember why. That's because within groups, um, selfish individuals share the benefit and avoid the cost. However, the presence of a second trait, which is forcing someone else to act individually, can reinforce the altruistic trait. And a great example of this is worker policing in honeybees. I mean, there's going to be a picture of a bee in the next slide, but always good to slow things down a little. So you may or may not know this. In some social insects, Hymenoptera, the workers are incapable of laying eggs. However, in honeybees and many other bees, the workers can lay eggs. They haven't gone on a mating flight, so that means none of the eggs are fertilized, which means they will all be what? Are they going to be, what's going to be special about the worker bees? Unfertilized, so they will all be haploid, which means they'll all be male. Okay, that saddens me. I bet you all knew that. So workers can lay male eggs, but only the queens can lay female and male eggs. So it's an interesting question. Um, what keeps workers from laying eggs, right? Because it seems like you should get a tremendous benefit. You lay eggs, and then all the other workers feed your offspring. Your fitness is going to be greater. You should be more related to your own offspring than you are to your mom's offspring, right? Because you share um, you share all your genes with your own male offspring, or I guess you share half your genes with your own male offspring. Um, so the interesting question is, why don't we see lots of workers laying? You do see workers laying in a honeybee colony if the queen dies and they can't recreate a new queen, right? So actually, if the queen normally dies, no big deal. There's plenty of eggs and young brood as long as you take um, a 3-day-old or less larva and feed it only royal jelly instead of stopping after 3 days, which is what they normally do, and you put it in an extra large cell and you feed it extra, you then get a new queen. So normally if the queen dies, that's no big deal. They just make a new queen. But if a queen dies and hadn't been laying eggs for a while, so it turns out that there's no very young hatchlings or eggs, now this colony is doomed. And now, because no one's going to be able to lay any more workers, and then all the workers start laying male eggs, so they can at least raise some drones. But what's interesting is, in the normally functioning hive, the reason why workers don't lay eggs is because other workers will remove them. They'll eat them. So this is a study by Foster and Ratniks where they added eggs either that were produced by queens from those colonies or worker laid eggs, and so they gather those over a bunch of days, and then they add them to the nest, and after 1 hour, most of the queen laid eggs remain. After 16 hours, you still have 3/4 of them remaining. After just 1 hour, almost all the worker laid eggs had been removed, right? So the workers can tell the difference between eggs laid by other workers versus eggs laid by queens, and they get rid of the worker eggs, but they remove only a small fraction of queen laid eggs. So in this case, workers don't lay eggs that often, but the reason why they don't lay eggs that often isn't necessarily because they really want to be altruistic, but because there's worker policing. Workers will get rid of eggs laid by other workers and enforce the cooperative behavior of rearing the queen's young. So, um, so costly punishment. So costly punishment is irrational, but the costs can be tiny. And so that means that any significant amount of group level selection might be able to maintain cheap altruistic punishment when it can't maintain straight costly altruism. Right? So at some point, there has to be some group level or kin level selection favoring that costly punishment. But what punishment allows is it allows a very low cost trait to enforce perhaps a very expensive altruistic trait, and then you only need group level selection to favor that relatively inexpensive punishing trait. So we're gonna talk about this, and so like one question is, how common is altruistic punishment in nature? So in animals, it might not be that common, and that's also because um, if it's going to exist, it's going to exist in an area where the costs are low, and that means that they're hard to measure, right? We might not have the statistical power to really detect a tiny cost, even if on net punishment is slightly costly. So there's like a statistical issue why we don't expect to see it, and then there's also like a levels of selection argument why we don't expect to see it. What we're going to talk about next week is how um, human societies with our patterns of cultural evolution actually make moralistic punishment much more evolutionarily feasible. Um, so it has been studied, so sort of reciprocity, and especially the punishment side of reciprocity, not just the withholding cooperation part of reciprocity, right? In Dawkins, reciprocity is all, I'm going to stop cooperating with jerks. But it's a little bit different when you talk about spending some, maybe tiny, but some real cost to punish individuals who are acting selfishly, to enforce cooperative behavior. That's what's called strong reciprocity. And so those examples are harder to find. So I'm going to talk just a little bit, and then we're going to do more next week. So one system where it's studied a lot, a great behavioral ecologist, Redwan Bashari, is looking at this, is looking at cleaning behavior in fish. And there's relationships between the different, so cleaning, what is cleaning behavior? Predators will have like parasites attached on the insides of their mouths, and little fish will come to give services of removing those parasites from the mouths of the predators. So if that's all they do, both sides benefit. But the little cleaning fish can get a bigger benefit for themselves if they occasionally just take a bite out of the flesh of the predator, who will then leave, or might eat the fish if it can, but oftentimes the little fish are a lot faster than the big fish. And that's that's the question. When they, if a cleaner fish takes a bite um, out of the client large fish that's being cleaned, um, it's going to get a food benefit itself. But first of all, there's some risk that the client's going to, try to attack it. But also, that means the client's going to leave because it's going to be like, screw this, you're being jerks. And then the other cleaner fish that was cleaning as a partner is going to lose the client. So it's not going to be able to get the small rewards of mucus and scales and parasites. Um, and it's not going to get the benefit of having taken a bite out of the host fish. Yeah, so that it's not like the people that write the movies, they read about animal behavior too. They sometimes then mostly butcher it and do horrible things like make people think that like baby adult ants are going to grow up into bigger adult ants, even though they're not. But there you go. So this has been studied on a number of contexts and layers. If you anesthetize the clients, then the little fish take more bites out of them, right? So some of it is the clients have to, um, be able to enforce behavior to some extent on the part of the cleaners. But then there's all these relationships among the cleaner fish themselves. So they sometimes clean in pairs. So you're seeing here, you've got right, two cleaner fish here and here that are cleaning this large grouper. And the cleaner fish face a prisoner's dilemma. Should they both behave nicely and not take bites out of their client fish? Um, Whoever bites first is the defector, and they get a benefit of probably a bigger mouthful. Them, interestingly, both of them share the cost of possibly the grouper host attacking them. So going to try to remove that echo. So this is a study by Bashari, and the parasitic saber-toothed blennies sneak bites out of larger fish. Um, there are the hosts will chase them, um, and when they do that, that increases the probabilities that the blennies are going to switch to another species. That's not an altruistic behavior by the blennies. That's just basically, actually, the blennies are basically trying to avoid um, long-term relationships in order to benefit more from selfish ones. Um, so the um, the chases reduce the attack rate on themselves as well, though. So if there's a chase, they're more likely to switch to another host, and they're less likely to get attacked. So this is not really showing cooperation among the blennies. It's mostly showing that the hosts can enforce cooperative behavior. But that's actually like a good subject because in the last few years there have been some interesting follow-up studies. I want to end with an example. I want to end with an example that shows that social situations don't just favor cooperative behavior. In fact, the only opportunity you ever have to cheat someone is if you're interacting with them. So social settings in some ways favor cheating in a way that solitary settings don't. So this is a system that's been studied now for like 20 years by Sarah Kahan, who's now at the University of Vermont. And there's a gradient, a sharp change in the social system of these desert ants called Mesopurgantii. And in some parts of their range, you only have single foundresses. I thought the echo was my fault, so I turned off my own volume, so I can't hear.
Hello.
I'd say make sure your mics are off. They usually are. They probably are. I thought the delay was caused someone's mic
Am I echoing?
was on. I thought it might have been because my volume was on, and that was causing the echo just on my machine. But now my volume is off. So this is either murder for you to hear, not so bad. But I'm going to try to finish it quickly. And then in the eastern area part of this range in Southern California, you usually have multiple queens to form a colony. And so this is these are small colonies. So the single foundress is going to lay all the eggs, and versus two queens getting together, working together to develop the nest and collect food, start feeding the young. Although eventually they usually fight to the death anyway. That's the part that's usually skipped in this description. So it's not like it's a fully friendly association. So what she was asking was whether social and solitary queens differ. So if you collect a female from this part of the range, if you collect a female from an area where everyone founds colonies in a solitary way, how do they change? Are they less cooperative than if you collect a female from an area where everyone founds colonies in pairs? Interesting. So she set up very simple colonies in the lab, either with a single solitary queen, a single social queen, um, sorry, I N is non-social, so I'm the worst person ever. A single solitary queen is over there. A single social queen is this one for social. Two social queens, two non-social queens, or one each. One social and one non-social. And the interesting thing is, um, there wasn't that much going on in any of the settings except this one, right? The most interesting pair is the one social with one non-social queen. And the non-social member of mixed pairs had lower survival, lost weight relative to all the other treatments. So basically what was going on in these colonies was that when you looked at the amount of time spent on different tasks, um, social foundresses the social foundresses spent more time um, laying eggs and then also, you know, doing interactions and fighting and other stuff. The non-social queens spent a lot more time working, excavation, digging, and less time on, feeding themselves and less on egg laying. And so what was really interesting was the non-social queens, because they've evolved in an area where they never have the opportunity to found a colony with another queen, they basically had not evolved the traits to, um, you know, hold back, make sure that the other one is working just as hard as they are. And so they get basically taken advantage of in these social settings. And then the social queen stops excavating, lets the non-social one do all that work, has more resources, lays more eggs, and then eventually kills them. And so it's a really interesting take home. I want like a bunch of take homes from this lecture. The first is, so when you read Dawkins, it's all about kin selection leading to cooperative behavior. It's important to understand that relatedness doesn't always lead to altruism. And one of the best examples is that white-fronted bee-eaters. The white-fronted bee-eaters only prevent close relatives from breeding. They're never punishing or harming non-relatives. Why? Because non-relatives won't respond to a failed breeding attempt by, helping a non-relative. They would only help relatives. And so you only get a benefit from basically harming your close relatives in this case. Um, Second, social situations and sociality doesn't necessarily lead to or depend on altruism. In other words, social situations are the only ones that give you an opportunity to take advantage of others. And so, taking advantage of others are socially adaptive traits in some cases. Those Mesopurgandii ant queens that we just talked about. And also punishment is a trait that only has to evolve in social situations, basically forcing others to behave altruistically. Um, Enforcement of social norms, um, indirect reciprocity, like you spending a little effort to make someone else do something very helpful to the entire group, can maintain cooperative and even altruistic behavior in groups. And then we're going to talk a lot more about enforcement and punishment, which itself is a form of altruism, although it might be a much cheaper trait than the altruistic traits that are being enforced or punished when they're not being done. Okay, that was all that I wanted to talk about tonight, but I actually do want to just zip back for a second and talk about migratory behavior as a group level selection, a group level trait. And if you got a zip, that's fine with me, although we have a few minutes even in the official lecture period. I just know that I didn't really get to finish that idea before last week. I think we ran out of time. Okay. So oh, it's breaking its brain. It's loading 5 zillion slides. I thought it had them ready. It didn't quite. And we're back. We're close to being back. Okay. So, the reason why I really love talking about migration is because taken away from the context of selfish gene ideas and altruism, people have been studying migration as a multi-level selection trait with no controversy or fighting or stuff for decades. It's it's only a problem because the altruism concept is so evocative psychologically and philosophically, it's something that we've worried a lot about. Um, and so in the context of migration, it just makes sense that of course you have selection among groups favoring this migratory behavior. And it's not altruistic, or it's not because it's selfish or selfless or helpful. So in insects, you often have polymorphisms for migration. In other words, you'll have some members of a species that have small wings, no wing muscles, and obviously neither the ability nor the motivation to fly. Then you'll have other individuals that have long wings and strong muscles that have to control those wings. And then there are costs to migration because first you have to build those muscles, and those muscles go in the part of your body that means that your abdomen's going to be smaller and you won't be able to lay as many eggs. And you also lose a lot of time. While the short-winged individuals are making eggs at a younger age, you are growing longer and spending time to invest in those muscles and then flying somewhere where you might die or disappear or never find a suitable patch. All these costs are trade-offs that migrants face. And so migratory individuals, the ones with long wings and long wing muscles, take longer to develop. The total number of eggs is lower. And when you're looking within populations, every migrant removes their migratory genes from that population. So within populations, there's always selection against migratory behavior. And so then the question remains evolutionarily, why do we still have migrants when they lay fewer eggs, they take longer to develop, and they're constantly disappearing? So every group is losing its migrants every generation. The answer is, yeah, that's happening, but every new population is started by a migrant, right? And so you have this trade-off. And since I need to finish the thing, I'm not going to make you puzzle over it, right? So migrants are, every population is losing its migrants because they lay fewer eggs, they take longer to do it, and then they leave, or they leave and you never see them again. But every new population is founded by migrants. And it's also important to note every existing population goes extinct eventually, right? So an old population might have lost most of its migrants, and it won't lose all of them probably because it's gaining migrants from the outside, but it'll be really low frequency. But then there's a fire and that patch disappears and they're not going to be there. So what's important sometimes is not just your population, but how many new populations the individuals that you share genes with found. So you have this trade-off between selection against migration within each group, but each new group is founded by migrants, and you can see this wonderful relationship. This is by Derek Roth, and I think it's Robert Deno, in the American Naturalist. They looked at persistence time, which they took a few years to document, is directly proportional to the size of ponds that were the habitat for these leafhoppers. And what they found was the larger the pond, the greater the persistence, the lower the proportion of macropters. Macropters means macro, it's these guys, means macropter. It's like opter wings, it means large wings. So in these really tiny ponds that were super ephemeral, you have a lot of long-winged individuals. You have a lot of flyers because they're constantly being recolonized by migrants. In the really large ponds that are stable, on a period for decades, and they never get wiped, they don't get wiped out, at least not on the scale that they've been studied, on a 100-year scale, you have very few long-winged individuals, right? So that's the trade-off. And this trade-off and this persistence of migrants is really important also for conservation and preservation of species, because as all habitats have become subdivided, they're now behaving like what are called metapopulations. A metapopulation is a collection of smaller populations. Each individual population is likely to go extinct, but the reason why the whole species doesn't go extinct is because patches get recolonized from other populations. And so a metapopulation is one where the only reason the whole metapopulation survives is because of recolonization. So you can kind of imagine this, populations are going extinct, but they're being recolonized. And so the persistence of these metapopulations depends on movement between subpopulations, which depends on survival, and also the motivation, the evolutionary persistence of this migratory dispersal trait. And the interesting thing is, as populations are getting more subdivided and the space between them is getting greater, that's actually selecting against migratory behavior, right? Because the fitness and survival of migrants goes down as the distances increase between them, which is a problem because the persistence of the entire metapopulation depends on this willingness of individuals to go on these almost suicidal missions. Okay, so I'm just going to leave you with this question: is migration, is that a group level or an individual level trait or something else? It's definitely a group level trait, but it doesn't fit within the altruistic, selfish continuum really, and so it's not been studied in such an ideological environment. Okay, and that's what I wanted to say about migration. Take homes from that earlier lecture: group selection. Dawkins said group selection never happens, but it's obviously happened because groups of cells got together, prokaryotes got together to make eukaryotes, groups of individual cells got together to make multicellular individuals where everyone is sacrificing some for the good of the group. So on the one hand, group selection, Dawkins says, never happens. On the other hand, every major transition was associated with group level selection, and selection operates on many levels at once. Often individual selection is the strongest, certainly among animals, and we're going to talk about why humans may actually be different. Okay, that's all I wanted to talk about. I'll hang out for a few minutes if there are questions, and I will see you next